Hello, psychology students. Welcome back for part 2 of our lecture regarding the cerebral cortex and hemisphere specialization or organization. So we already covered these first two learning targets in our previous part, in part 1 of this lecture series. And today we're going to now focus on the ones that are highlighted in yellow. So we'll be talking about the key contributions of Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga in terms of our understanding of the two hemispheres and split brain research. And then we're also going to talk about neuroplasticity regarding brain injuries, and also how neuroplasticity relates to us, even if we haven't gone through necessarily traumatic injuries. So let's go ahead and get into our content. All right, so for our first slide here, let's talk about the hemispheres. So the cerebrum is divided into two separate hemispheres, and humans are not more left-brained or more right-brained. If you've ever heard someone say that, or if you've ever heard someone say, humans only use 50% of their brain capacity, anything like that is just a myth. There's really no science behind that. So yes, while we have two hemispheres that are specialized in different skills in different areas, our entire brain works together to perform these activities in an integrated fashion. So your right hemisphere has certain things that it focuses on. Your left brain, your left hemisphere has certain things that it processes regarding, spatial abilities, language, memory, hearing, vision, etc. And also, there's this little nerve fiber here called the corpus callosum, and we've learned a lot about it through Michael Gazzaniga's and Roger Sperry's split brain research that we'll talk about here in a minute. But through this little corpus callosum, this nerve fiber, your two hemispheres are constantly in communication with each other, back and forth, back and forth. So everything that happens on your right side is generally processed through your left hemisphere, and everything that happens on your right side, on your left side, is processed by your right hemisphere, regarding all of these skills that our brain processes. All right, so when we look at non-split brain patients, we have these specific skills like spatial, language, memory, hearing, and vision. And each side of the brain, each hemisphere, is going to have different abilities and skill sets. And so the major differences, the key cut differences that we see between these two is that the left hemisphere is going to be more so related to language ability, whereas the right hemisphere is going to be more so associated with spatial ability. So when we look at vision, for instance, on the left hemisphere, you only see that it is more associated with words, letters, whereas on the right side, it's going to be related to geometric patterns, faces, like facial recognition, and emotional expression, facial expression, right? So as I mentioned earlier, this is probably, the facial aspect is probably related more so to the temporal lobe on the right side of the brain, right? When we talked about prospagnosia, that's such a hard word to say, when people lose facial recognition, all right, it's going to be related to that region of the brain. Hearing, on the left side, we're going to see language sounds. Hearing on the right hemisphere is going to be non-language sounds, so anything that isn't related to speaking or language or understanding. Memory, again, right, you see that the left hemisphere is going to be associated with language, so verbal memory, and then the right hemisphere, non-verbal memory. And then when it comes to language, the right hemisphere does have some association with language, but more so the emotional tone. So that's another thing we're noticing with the right hemisphere. It seems to be associated with emotions, as you saw in vision and also in language, whereas language in the left hemisphere is going to be far more complex. And this is where those association areas are, where we talked about language expression and also language comprehension, about the association area, Broca and Wernicke areas. So the language ability of the left is going to be associated with speech, grammar rules, reading and writing, and arithmetic. And then on the right-hand side, we see this is the only hemisphere with spatial ability, regarding geometry, sense of direction, and distance and mental rotation. So anything related to spatial ability is going to be associated with the right side, and then the left side is far more associated with language skills. Okay. Next, we have this little brain structure here called the corpus callosum. Okay, so I mentioned this in our first slide, but the corpus callosum is the large band of neural nerve fibers that connects these two sides of the brain together, to the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, sending information back and forth. So it's kind of like a bridge, I guess you could say, for your brain, and this would include anything regarding muscle movement, images that we see, things that we hear, shapes that we see, emotions that we experience, speech, right, spatial awareness, math and arithmetic, anything that requires the use of our brain to process information, whether it's from sensory, our corpus callosum is going to send that information back and forth. So the corpus callosum is made up of 1 million nerve fibers that connect these two hemispheres together. So it's really a pretty incredible little brain structure. So Roger Sperry would be the man who would be most known for the contributions to split brain research, and he actually won the Nobel Prize in 1981. Michael Gazzaniga, who was also important for this field of research, would further add greater input to what Roger Sperry had already founded. So Michael Gazzaniga's work would come later. Roger Sperry's first research was done on cats, actually, and so he severed the corpus callosum of these cats and did an experiment with them in which he walked these cats through a maze. The cat's right eye was covered, and therefore the left brain processed that information, and the cat figured out how to find the food in the maze using his left hemisphere, right? If you're seeing out of your right eye, your left hemisphere is that which is processing the information. And then vice versa, he would then cover the right eye and have the cat walk through it using its left eye. And in this case, it was using the right brain. And therefore, because it had only processed it through its left hemisphere, the right brain had no idea where to go when using its left eye. And so the cat had a hard time finding the food and basically had to relearn the maze because the left and right hemispheres were no longer communicating with each other. In the 1960s, this would then later be used to actually sever the corpus callosum for 4 patients who had severe epilepsy, and they agreed to this procedure and to also be a part of the split brain research of the future so that we could understand what happens when you remove this part of the brain. Now, when we're looking again at these hemispheric differences, this image here is a great example of how our brain processes visual stimuli. Okay, and we talked about the corpus callosum already and how it communicates back and forth between the two hemispheres, but we haven't talked about the optic chiasm. So the optic chiasm, okay, is located here, just at really the forebrain, base of our forebrain. It's a very little structure, and it's where the optic nerve of the right eye meets to carry information to the left hemisphere of the brain, and where the optic nerve of the left eye carries information to transmit to the right hemisphere of the brain. So you've got your left visual field of the pencil, right? This is going to go through your optic nerve, and then at the optic chiasm, it's going to be switched around and processed by your right hemisphere, and the same thing goes with the apple. In your right visual field, it's going to go through your right optic nerve, and then at the forebrain, the optic chiasm, it's going to switch over and be processed by your left hemisphere. And the only time that a brain will not function this way is if it is a split brain patient and the corpus callosum has been severed. So if you damage the optic chiasm, you'll actually have a very difficult time with hand-eye coordination because your hemispheres are not going to be able to properly process the information that's coming through the optic nerves. So if you look at this MRI scan, again, MRI stands for magnetic resonance imaging, and it's used to show high resolution pictures of soft tissue structures, right? Like the brain, definitely a soft tissue structure. And it's not used to show functioning of those structures. Okay, it's just used to show whether like detailed high resolution images of the structures. Whereas if you wanted to look more so at the functioning and the structure, you would look at something like an fMRI. Okay, so when we look at split brain surgery and what it involves cutting this certain brain structure that we've talked about, called the corpus callosum. Okay, you're not getting rid of the optic chiasm. Optic chiasm is still going to stay there, but the corpus callosum, this big nerve fiber here between the left and right hemisphere, is going to be severed, and so this is going to isolate your right hemisphere and your left hemisphere. Now, when we talk about brain surgery, it's generally the last resort, right, to fix something. But of the brain surgeries out there, this is one of the more common ones used to help people who deal with epilepsy, right, which is a neurological disorder that's caused by sensory neuron disturbance, and it creates reoccurring convulsions or seizures that are quite severe than normal seizures. And so when this region of the brain is cut, you're not going to see really any differences in terms of intelligence or personality or emotion, but you will see a difference in how they process visual abilities and tactile abilities. Okay, visual abilities meaning, how we use language to report things that we see, and then tactile abilities meaning how we are able to identify hidden objects in our hands without using language to report what we've seen, because our left hemisphere is related to our language, and so when something is using our right hemisphere, our left hemisphere can't necessarily use language to report what our right hemisphere is processing. So let's look at an example here. So in Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzanica's research, the first experiment that they had done with human patients who went through this procedure was a visual testing device, and the patient would look at this screen here, and they would stare into the red dot. Images or words would pop up on the left-hand side and the right-hand side. The patient would then respond to the questions that Michael Gazzanica would ask. And so one of those questions would be, tell me what you saw. And then the other question would be, now point to me what you saw with your left hand. So when asked to say what he had saw, in this case, so I'm going to flash a word for you, so go ahead and stare at the screen. Okay, when asked to say, what did you see? The split brain patient would say, art. I saw the word art. Okay, but then when asked to point with the left hand what they had seen, they would point to he. Now, what's the reason for this? Why did this happen? Okay, well, again, we have to think about our hemispheres and how they process different information, right, through the optic chiasm. What we see through our right side, our right visual field, is processed by our left hemisphere. And our left hemisphere is responsible for our language. It reports our language. So, in this case, when asked to point with the left hand, he points to he. He doesn't point to art. Why is this? Because our left hand is controlled by our right hemispheres. All of our left movements are controlled by our right brain, and all of our right movements are controlled by our left hemisphere. And so this really proved the significance of split brain research and how our brains, our hemispheres do communicate through this divided consciousness. So it really is quite an incredible sense of research, and it further helped us understand how the left brain is more linked to speaking, writing, mathematical calculations, and arithmetic, and how the right hemisphere is more linked to skills regarding spatial abilities, symbolic abilities, and emotion and artistic abilities. And so each hemisphere, especially for split brain research, really does have a mind of its own. And regarding tactile abilities, when pictures were shown of something like, say, like a spoon, the right hemisphere would not be able to communicate anything, right? So if a spoon was shown to the right hemisphere through the left eye, and Michael Gazzanica said, what did you see? They generally could not say, they wouldn't say anything. They would say, I didn't see anything. But then he would do it again with a different picture, or he would show the spoon again later on in the test, and the patient was generally able to select the correct item that was readily in front of them, and he was able to squeeze it with his hand and said, I saw this item. But he couldn't say it, he couldn't verbalize it, and that is because our left hemisphere processes language, not our right hemisphere. All right, so hopefully you were able to complete these questions and get them right. So the answers here, if the person is asked to tell what is seen, they're going to say ice cream, right? And then if the right hand is used to point to the object seen, it's going to point to ice cream as well, because the left hemisphere controls my right hand. And then the patient is asked to use the left hand to point to what is seen, and the patient will point to palm tree. So let's look at another example of a split brain demo. And in this case, the patient is asked to draw these two items at the same time. So simultaneously, I want you to go ahead and try to do this same thing. You're going to draw a square with your left hand and a circle with your right hand. Get two writing utensils and do it at the exact same time. See how you do. Now, if you're like most normal brain patients, okay, this is going to be very difficult for you. However, it's very simple for split brain patients to be able to do this simultaneously as well as accurately. And the reason for this is because of the disconnect between the two hemispheres, right? Where our hemispheres are not disconnected, but they're connected, and they're working together, right, to communicate information. In this case, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere are now working and operating independently, and therefore they can do this activity with ease. So go ahead and answer this question. I want you to think about it for a minute. What is the difference between a split brain patient and an intact brain patient, right, a normal brain? What's the difference between the two based on what we've talked about so far? Go ahead and respond in the comment section. So now that you've had a minute to do that, okay, when we look at the normal brain, the intact brain, right, information is constantly being transferred and communicated across this corpus callosum. So both hemispheres are in sync. They're working together, right? The left hemisphere knows what the right hemisphere is doing, and the right hemisphere knows what the left hemisphere is doing. But it's different when we look at split brain patients, right? This is where transference is not occurring. So the left hemisphere does not know what the right hemisphere is doing, and the right hemisphere does not know what the left hemisphere is doing. So researchers can actually send information to one hemisphere and test these patients to see if both hemispheres know what is happening. Now, although life is difficult for split brain individuals at first, especially the first several months, maybe 3 to 6 months after surgery, it eventually figures out a way to work. It figures out a way to operate. And so the reason for this is because of brain plasticity, right? So brain plasticity, also known as neuroplasticity, is the brain's ability to continuously change and rewire itself. So this is most predominantly seen in children, but also in adults as well, as the brain is able to capacitate a way of modifying itself and growing in new ways, kind of similar to how soft plastic has the ability to be molded into different shapes. The brain is similar in that sense. So in this image, actually, this is not related to a split brain patient, but this is a child's brain who has basically lost the majority of her right hemisphere due to chronic seizures that threatened her life. And so because of hemispheric specialization, right, in the cross-wiring of the brain, she generally would not have been able to move anything on her left side of her body due to the right hemisphere being basically severed. And so, however, because of plasticity, her left hemisphere compensated itself by putting other areas of the brain to work. She's actually able to function almost normally, with still a little bit of dysfunction in her and her opposite hand movement. But for the most part, her brain is fine and her body is fine, and she's able to live independently. Brain plasticity is pretty incredible, how our brains can rewire itself and still figure out a way to compensate for areas that have been lost. Now let's look at this example here regarding discoveries of neuroscience and how it more so affects us when we're talking about neuroplasticity, right? The brain's capacity for modification and growth. How does your brain seek modification and growth? Well, for better or for worse, actually. And so we look at these are a couple books that I read, and this is not obviously going to be on your test, but I think it's helpful in the sense of understanding the aspect of neuroplasticity and brain detox and the effect our thoughts have on us. And so if we look at these books written by Dr. Caroline Leaf, she has her doctorate in neuroscience, so she knows a lot about the brain and how it works and the anatomy and the psychology of how our brains are wired. And so her first book here was Who Switched Off My Brain, this orange book on the left, and then her more recent book is Switch On Your Brain. And this book here on the right, the blue one, is about this 21-day brain detox, and she talks about the science behind 21 days and how 21 days is needed to develop a new habit, and how we have to basically clean and organize our thought life in order to actually flourish, right? If our thoughts are constantly toxic, it's going to have a toxic result, not just on our psychology, but also our biology. So this goes back to the explanation of, the biopsychosocial approach, even in the sense of everything that is psychological is also biological. So there's a lot of evidence that would prove this, okay? If you are extremely stressed and anxious for very long, extended periods of time, what's that going to do to your body? Well, it's going to affect you, and not in a good way. It's going to affect you in a negative way, right? You're going to become exhausted, sickly, right? And that may in turn affect your relationships and your work and your finances, and then it just continues to pile up. She goes on to explaining this from a biblical lens of what our thought life should look like, and the neuroscience and the biology and the science behind our thought life and what it actually does and how it impacts our brain. So she even talks about in here a little bit regarding correlational research about thought patterns and how they are actually linked oftentimes to illnesses. Okay, now that's not to say that these illnesses, like she mentions Alzheimer's disease, there is actually a lot of correlational studies that show fear of Alzheimer's increases your chances by over 50% of actually getting Alzheimer's, of actually developing Alzheimer's in your lifetime. So while that statistic's a little scary, it's just meant to help us understand and realize that, hey, what we think about affects our cell divisions and how our bodies work and operate. So everything that's psychological is biological. And of course, there are other environmental factors. There are obviously hereditary factors when looking at things like Alzheimer's. So that's not meant to offend anyone. There are chemical factors. There are abuse factors. There are accidents and serious illnesses, and also birth effect factors, okay, that go into play with these. But we do need to also take into consideration the power of our thought life. So manage your mind. Don't let it run you. You've got to clean up your mind. You've got to organize your thoughts in a way that allows you to function and flourish in the way that you were created to. Lastly, I'm going to give you guys this mini FRQ. I gave you the first mini FRQ in the previous lecture, so here's part 2. Go ahead and read this and respond in the comment section, and then I will go ahead and post the answers for you in the feedback after you finish up. All right, guys, that's it for today. Take care.